There's a new way to improve food supply resilience while lowering the environmental impacts.
Precision fermentation
to transform the dairy industry.
What are we doing here? We're prioritizing high dairy consumption for a consumer that doesn't even want to eat it.
In this capitalist system, this is the only way to disrupt these industries.
Are you in La La Land right now?
Create a hellscape! What is your perspective on the whole argument of like processed foods versus whole foods?
My question is usually like, what ingredient do you have an issue with, right? Because if someone sees like processed soy on an ingredient label, I'm like, well, that's tofu. That's tempeh. That's just soybeans broken down into a different form of soy. And that's processed. Chopping vegetables is processing them. Like, let's be honest, everything is processed in the way we eat it. I think most people think because it's mixed with another type of chemical that they are unfamiliar with. So that's usually like where I try to ask questions. What are you more concerned with? Is it an emulsifier? Is it a preservative? When we start to think about things that are put in our foods to preserve it, to give it shelf life, how we add additional vitamin D into certain foods like cereals, we also have to consider that the reason why we do that is to fortify foods for people that may not have access to fresh fruits and vegetables, and that this may be the only thing that they can eat that can give them the adequate daily amounts of vitamins, minerals, and nutrition that they need, which is sad to us, right? When we go, what, you're just going to eat your cereal to get your vitamins? Well, if you live in a food desert, don't be surprised if that is where you get your protein and carbohydrates and fat from, right? Like if you don't like processed food, but like then you just realize, oh, well, tofu is just like breaking down soybean to be a block. It's not really processed in the way that I think. Then serving it doesn't really become a problem. So I think education really is important here.
Klaus, I'm going to ask you, what do you think is the future of meat in general, either plant-based or the meat industry itself?
You know what? I used to think it would be the plant-based products that are going to disrupt the meat industry and the cultivated meat. But what I actually think it will be is a technology called precision fermentation. From a technical standpoint, step one is when the gene responsible for the production of milk protein in cows would be inserted into yeast. That's step one. Step two, the gene then instructs the yeast on how to produce the milk protein. And finally, step three, the protein and yeast combination is then placed in a fermenter where it multiplies quickly and produces many milk proteins, which are identical to the ones the cows produce. And that's the key word here, identical.
My question here is, you're building this for a consumer base that wants to eat meat and dairy. But when you go out and do the man on the street interviews, which I did in the city of Las Vegas, we find that 90% of them do not want these processed, fermented approaches to their natural meat and dairy. What are we doing here? We're prioritizing high meat consumption, high dairy consumption in food policy for a consumer that doesn't even want to eat it. Do better, folks. Do better.
I think it's not going to be the consumer that chooses this. It's going to be without the consumer even knowing. I mean, at the moment, right, we've got insulin in medicine.
How dare you provide nudge science to these people? No way humanly possible will that happen. People will riot in the streets. I'm telling you, like, if we continue to prioritize high meat, high dairy consumption and food policy, these things won't change. What we need to do is to change the subsidies. We need to make these products so exploitively expensive as they really are that people stop consuming them, or they consume them less because they can't afford it.
So if you look at insulin, right, that used to be taken from pig, and now it's produced using precision fermentation. So the medical industry has innovated because they see that using precision fermentation is cheaper, is more scalable, and it's more appropriate for the industry. We see it with ingredients within cheese at the moment, like rennet. All I'm saying is, along with shifting subsidies and there being more conscious consumers, I think there'll be more and more business disruptions that favor these kind of industries that reduce
Maybe,
the amount.
but they're building pig complexes in China. So what you're saying here does not correlate. Just because they created insulin from pigs does not mean that we haven't had less dependence on pigs for other things.
That's because meat industry there, right? That's not the medical industry driving it.
But what you're talking about is the food industry. So my question is, just because we're providing a new product, just because we provide Impossible doesn't mean that people are eating less meat. What we're seeing in our research at GBD is 98% of consumers eat meat are also buying plant-based meats. That's wonderful. They have multiple options. But what I see here is now you're just giving multiple options for people to consume the same type of product.
So you're saying it's confusing for the consumer, right? On the one hand, you have initiatives and a consensus growing that we need to reduce the amount of meat and dairy consumed. And you think that these technologies will perpetuate that misinformation?
Not perpetuate, but I think until it is involved in policy implementation, like the city of West Hollywood has now put forward a plant-forward food policy, right? When they work with GBD, they've actually developed it. They're trying to serve more plant-forward foods at all of their events or across the city of West Hollywood. Bravo. I hope more people take note from you, West Hollywood. But the thing is, they've instituted a policy that now seems that it could go, oh, well, you know what? We'd also like to make this part of our policy, including more precision fermentation, so we have less reliance on CAFOs and animal agriculture. And the only way these things change is if we start to institute policy change at the government level. And so we can come up with all of these great ideas, but it's a matter of like, who's in your pocket? And this is where the problem of like, well, yeah, you're going to create this industry, but now do you also have to have lobbyists associated with it?
Well, yeah, that's what I was going to say. The lobbying is a major issue.
And then we just run that circus over and over and over again. So when we talk about institutional change, we really need to talk about what is going to impact people to stop eating less meat and dairy. Money, cost, and place it on the consumer. Try that first before we start implementing all of these ways to create new types of milk, in my opinion.
What's crazy is that my thinking coming into this conversation is very much aligned with yours, in that actually it's not about capitalist food innovation. It's about people eating a little bit more consciously. However, I do look at precision fermentation. I do just look at that unconscious consumer. Like you're talking about the conscious consumer and putting efforts into growing that community of people that will make more conscious decisions. That will be ideal. I just don't know if it will happen quickly enough. I think we need initiatives and provisions for that growing conscious consumer base and capitalist innovations that will help
the
the
thing is,
unconscious.
you have to inform the consumer what they're purchasing and what they're buying at the grocery store. You have to let them know what they're consuming. Even when we work with institutions at a college, even though we try and say, don't name it tofu wrap and call it like garden buffalo wrap, we still have to indicate in the ingredients what is in it, or at least what allergies could come from that, whether they have a soy allergy, right, or a wheat allergy. So you do have to inform your consumers what they're eating.
But they're not informed at the moment. We could go around and there's so much depth to this topic.
You're building something without even asking the consumer base or measuring if the consumer base even wants it.
I do wonder if it's like maybe a sort of stepping stone idea, like what Klaus was saying. It might not be the idea, but it might shift the industry far enough that the CAFOs and whatever start to close and decline meanwhile, because they can't keep up price-wise. But because this is the thing, when it's animal lives, there just is a cost to raising animals. There's a cost both in like pounds, but also like
I love you guys so much, but I'm like, how are you in La La Land right now? Like, companies are going to create this, and then it is going to be like the JBS. It's going to be the Tysons that buy these particular smaller based companies and still utilize the science and then still have their CAFOs. And then what kind of control are we having then? What quality of meat and quality of dairy are we now replicating through this precision fermentation?
It is a dangerous road in some aspects.
I just don't think we talk about the limitations enough and like the risks to create such a high level scientific approach that we know is driven by capitalistic means. And so that our biggest producers of meat and dairy will then eventually do what? They want to tap into it. And then they will buy these organizations and run them. So then they can profit off of it and run it as they see fit. So I kind of just am using this off of my historical experience of what it's been like to work with these large, almost monopolistic style of companies, these oligarchs now when we think about like the Metas and the Teslas, and you're putting an expectation of idealism in the hands of people that don't think like us. And I think that is incredibly dangerous, folks.
Sounds like you are potentially more against the capitalist aspect of this.
Obviously.
As opposed to the inherent technology.
Because I think that's what drives everything. We see Ozempic as a fad, but really people with type 2 diabetes and with debilitating disease that need this medication haven't been able to get it because it's being charged for $1,800 a vial. That's absurd. It's absurd. We do this all the time. And I don't think food is any different than medicine.
What's the solution? Someone help us. Rid of healthcare. But like I do think you're right about it's a money thing, it's a price thing. If we could get it to the point where animal agriculture are no longer getting the subsidies they're getting, and those are being shifted towards plant-forward companies, that would really help because, there is a disparity. Like maybe in the US it's different, but I feel like here, Klaus, the plant-based products are more expensive. I feel like they are anyway. Maybe it's because they're newer companies. They just don't have like the economies of scale or, it could be that. But if that could shift the subsidy question, I think you'd see people making different choices.
We need to have a lot of infrastructural changes in the way we run our countries, the way we run our businesses, and the way we run our governments. That's where I think we'll see the science flourish. But we have to have the right people lead to ensure that these measures are here to help people, not just build profit.